I'm Jackie Anderson. I'm a school psychologist at World City SU 11, and I am pleased to do your introduction today for your session, working together to get youth in their seats, solving school transportation issues. And I'm also pleased to I'll introduce ladies first, and this is Kristin Kelly. She is a staff attorney at the American Bar Association on Children in the Law. At the center, Ms. Kelly works primarily in the area of youth, transitioning from foster care, youth empowerment, and the educational needs of children in foster care. She provides training and technical assistance across the country on these topics, including providing expertise on the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act through the National Child Welfare Resource Center on legal and judicial issues. Additionally, she's a staff member of the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education, a national technical assistance and training resource and clearinghouse for the educational needs of children in foster care. She's authored numerous articles and publications, including the Education Advocacy Chapter of the National Association of Counsel for Children's textbook, Child Welfare Law and Practice. Prior to joining the ABA, Ms. Kelly served as guardian ad litem as well as legal mediator in the domestic relations cases. Ms. Kelly obtained her JD from Indiana University School of Law and her Bachelor of Arts, from the University of Notre Dame. She is a member of the Illinois Bar. And I'm also pleased to introduce live and in person, Roger Reikofski. He's a consultant and coordinator with the Nebraska Department of Education. He focuses on federal programs from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 as authorized or as reauthorized by the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. Specific program expertise includes the McKinney-Vento Homeless Education Assistance Act, the Rural Education Achievement Program, and several federal formula programs such as Title I-A, Title II-A, and Title III from NCLB. Prior to services at NDE, Roger was an elementary educator, high school coach, and part-time athletic director for 13 years at Wayne Public Schools in Wayne, Nebraska. He has a bachelor's in elementary education and a master's in education administration from Wayne State College in Wayne, Nebraska. Please help me welcome them to Nebraska.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? I apologize for being on webcam. I'm about 7 months pregnant, and so the doctor put a stop to my traveling. But I am missing being at what I know has been a really great conference the past couple days. Thanks to all of you for being here. Since it's a smaller group, and since we have a pretty targeted topic, we really want to make sure that this is pretty discussion oriented. Can you see the PowerPoint up on the screen?
No.
Yes?
No.
Okay. So anything that we refer to in terms of websites or anything like that will be up on the PowerPoint, but I believe you also have the PowerPoint available on your flash drive. If it's okay with you and Roger, maybe you could facilitate having them go around the room and just sort of say what their name is and what organization they work for, just so that we have an idea of who is all with us.
Okay, start right over here.
I'm Tim Garcia. I'm an elementary school principal in McCook, Nebraska.
I'm Brenda Lukey. I'm a supervisor with Nebraska Families Collaborative.
I'm Bob O'Neill, and I'm a juvenile court judge in Sarpy and Odo counties.
I'm Brooker, and I'm a school community liaison with Nebraska.
I'm Dave Newell, and I'm CEO of Nebraska Families Collaborative.
I'm Vicki Weiss, and I'm the Nebraska Court Improvement Director.
I'm Pat Frost. I'm with the Department of Ed, and I work with neglected and delinquent populations in Title I.
KPI is the Department of Ed, working in special education.
Nikki Peterson, School Social Worker for Kearney Public.
Sounds like
an airplane just landed.
No, not at all. I was having a little difficulty hearing you. So it's loud now?
No, it's good. There was just some background noise, and it sounded kind of like an airplane landing or taking off.
No, I wish. No.
Okay.
I'm Sue Rutt with CASA in South Central Nebraska. We cover Adams, Clay, Knuckles County. Adams, Clay, Knuckles, and Webster County.
And I'm Chris Hannes, I'm the Child Welfare Policy Administrator for Health and Human Services.
Good morning, I'm Cami Pacoda. I'm with the Omaha Public Schools and I'm a Student Personnel Assistant.
I'm Amy Sadie, School Community Liaison and a Wellness Liaison for Hastings Public Schools.
Kim Davis, I'm school community liaison for Hastings as well, and I'm also.
I'm Wes DeLucia with the Omaha Public Schools. I'm also the Director of Operations for the Goals Project in Omaha.
I'm Greg Beal from Ogallala. I'm a guardian ad litem.
I'm Rebecca Fernand, Children and Family Services Specialist.
You are around the room, Kristin.
All right, that's everybody. Okay, now as I said, I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing all of you, so if you have questions, maybe Roger, if you can make sure to repeat them just to make sure that we hear everything. But thanks everyone. It sounds like we have a really good mix of sort of the judicial and court side, some school staff and administration, and then also some child welfare agency staff. So this should be a good discussion for the group. Let me just provide you a quick little outline of what we're going to go over today. We're going to be talking about the McKinney-Vento Act and the Fostering Connections Act, and specifically we're going to be talking about providing children transportation to be able to remain in their same schools. We're going to have a discussion with you about some of the challenges that you're facing and try and solve some of those barriers that you might be facing. And then we're going to wrap up by making sure that we give you a lot of tools and resources to take with you. So speaking of tools and resources, the first thing that I will give you is our project's website. The address is www.ambar.org/legal center. That's really sort of the one thing that you should be taking away from this session, hopefully, which is that we are a project that's designed to support you. We have a lot of tools and materials available if you're interested in this topic, as I know you are because you're in this session. It's a great way to sort of stay in the loop. We have a listserv available that you can ask questions on. It's also the way to sort of stay up to date with everything that's going on. The purpose of our project, it started in 2007, and it was designed because we knew that, education agencies don't have a lot of familiarity with children and the needs of children in the child welfare system. And the child welfare system isn't necessarily the most aware of all the educational needs of children that are in care. And then the juvenile court, which is supposed to be sort of overseeing the role of the child welfare agency, also isn't always sure exactly what to do around education. And so the idea of our project was to sort of bridge the silos between these different agencies and really help all stakeholders that are involved, whether you're with an agency or with a school or with the court, to be able to have the resources that you need to appropriately advocate for children, not just at the children or the child-specific level, but also sort of at the system level. So our project is really designed to do both. Can I just see a quick show of hands? How many of you have been to other education sessions this week? Oh, good. So you're sort of the teacher's pets. You already have gotten all the education information. So I'm not going to go in a lot of detail then about the Fostering Connections Act. I assume that you've already heard a lot about the Fostering Connections Act. But as we talked about, the session today is primarily focused on transportation and keeping kids to be able to remain in their same school. The Fostering Connections Act, as you all well know, was passed in 2008, and it really placed some pretty major responsibilities on child welfare agency for the very first time. And it made it clear that child welfare agencies are responsible for ensuring school stability for children that are in care. The first requirement is that they have to ensure that unless it's not in the child's best interest, that they have to remain in their same school. So of course, it's a pretty strong presumption that there needs to be a determination as to whether it's in the child's best interest, and if it is in the child's best interest, then they need to remain there. It's not always going to be in the child's best interest, and so the second part of Fostering Connections requires that if they are going to be moving schools, they should be immediately and appropriately enrolled with all of the education records transferred along with them. So of course, you all know from your own experience some of the challenges that children in care face. There's oftentimes frequent living placement changes. With each of those living placement changes, oftentimes come school changes. And And that together has compounded to result in some pretty poor educational outcomes across the country for children that are in care. The Fostering Connections Act isn't designed to fix all the educational problems of children that are in care, but it is designed to at least work on one, which is keeping kids in their same school, so that at least that they have their connections to their home community, connections to their school and their friends, as long as it's in their best interest. So what we're not going to be talking about today is sort of the breadth of fostering connections and what it actually requires in terms of making those best interest decisions. We're not going to talk about who should be involved in making those decisions or what to even do if disputes arise around those. But what we are going to be talking about is for the children that it's in their best interest to remain in the same school, that a determination has been made that staying in that same school is going to require some type of transportation. How are we going to get them there? That's sort of the focus of today. And before we sort of move on, I would love to hear from any of you, what brought you to this session or what specific challenges are you facing around school transportation, just to try and make sure that we can kind of address some of those as we go on. Does anyone have any specific examples or challenges that you're facing?
Well, I'm from Omaha, and we seem to have a lot of difficulty with kids in their same school if they get removed and go across Omaha to a different foster home or relative placement. The distance traveling to get them back to their home school is difficult for families, and the Omaha bus system, school bus system doesn't always seem to follow them, especially if they don't have an IEP.
Did you hear that okay?
Roger, could you help me with just a summary of that one?
Basically, tell me if I'm wrong in the summary. She's from Omaha, and just because of the size of Omaha and school A being on this side of town and school B on this side of town, if they move across town, it's kind of a logistical nightmare trying to coordinate transportation in a larger district.
Yeah, great one. That's the definite challenge. We will talk about that. Any other challenges that you guys are facing?
Go ahead.
We have a group home in North Platte, so we get kids from all over the area. So it can be as far as Grand Island to, closest Hershey, which is like 12 miles away. But I guess I'm curious as to those kids have it's never even been discussed that they're going to their home district. So I'm curious as to 12 boys, 12 beds, 12 different locations, how you would overcome that obstacle.
Did you hear that one, Kristin?
Actually, I might need to repeat on all of them. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine. She's in North Platte, town of about 25,000. And they have a group home there, and they draw, is it just boys or boys and girls?
Just boys.
Just boys in from all over the area. Some as close as communities 12 miles away, and others maybe 100 miles away. And at any time, the 12 boys might be from 12 different schools, and she hasn't heard too much talk about the keeping the kids in their, what we call school of origin, the school they were in when they came there. So.
Okay, great one. Thanks.
Okay, we have another one?
Okay, we've had a couple of cases in rural Nebraska, central Nebraska, where the child is disrupted in the foster home and has been placed in Madison Detention Center for up to 60 days or more.
Okay.
What happens to them?
And you're talking about an even greater distance there, right? The scenario there is student is placed in Madison, Nebraska, which is in northeast Nebraska. It has a detention facility. Is that the right term to use?
Yes.
Okay. And so what do they do in that situation when it's maybe 200 miles? Correct?
Correct, and it's for a minimum of 60 days. We've had kids in there longer, not attending school.
What are some of the longer durations you've seen?
I've heard up to 90.
60 to 90 days in that facility then.
But it's a detention facility, so they're not allowed to leave.
Correct.
There is a school.
Yeah, they do schooling there.
At the center?
Yeah, it's a Rule 18 school.
Okay.
They can earn credits.
Because I've been told it wasn't, so
Yeah.
we do intend to go tour it sometime.
Yeah, that's very nice.
Kristin, what
So it sounds like, I mean, of the challenging, well chosen, because because they sort of span and urban and sort of everything in between in terms of.
Kristin, can you hear me? And I'm not technical. Sorry, everyone. Is anybody good with Skype or anything? Kristin, you're breaking up right now. We've kind of lost you. Sorry.
Oh, no problem.
Could you go see if you can
I'll
find
see if
her
I can get a tech person in. The camera's on her, so.
Okay.
That's what we've gotten, sorry.
And everybody, the reason I'm standing up here is she's videotaping, so she asked me to stay up here. So it's not like I'm trying to be standoffish or anything. But while we're waiting to get that fixed, go ahead back there.
If we could have some discussion about who's responsible for arranging transportation and who's responsible for pay.
Okay. I think we're going to touch on that a little bit too. It's not a real black and white thing, but we'll kind of, yes, touch on that too.
Or whether IEP or no IEP makes a difference.
Yes. Very well.
The request has been placed.
Okay. While we're waiting to get Kristin back, how many of you have heard of the McKinney-Vento Act as far as schools and students in that situation? Okay. How many of you have heard a lot about it? A lot about it. Okay. Some of you just some. Okay. Great. Well, that's why I'm here to kind of, in those situations, a student that is placed in the foster care system at some time during that placement, in the early stages, by definition, is homeless. So there's a definite correlation between foster care placement, transportation there, and prior to that placement and transportation at that point. So, Kristin, try again. Can you hear us?
Is that any better?
Well, we just heard you say that.
Okay. Well, I can hear you, Roger. You're doing great.
Well, okay, I'll keep going because we don't have, for some reason, your audio is really cutting out, and we want to hear what you're saying. So until we get it fixed, I'll just talk for a while.
All right, perfect.
The lady in the back talked about, I think if I remember right, coordination of transportation services. When is it this person's job? When is it this person's job, or this funding source, or this funding source, or whatever? Okay, and we're going to talk about that. There are some gray areas with that, so it's not clear cut just because of the way the laws are written. The only thing that we ever ask is, oh good, she's in here. We can't, her audio is cutting out.
We're going to be able to hear her. We can shut off the video and put the PowerPoint up and hear her, but I'll get rid of it.
Yeah, let's do that. That's a win-win. Perfect.
Try again now, Kristin.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.
So, did I miss anybody else? Kind of different things going on there. Other transportation things that you want to hear about today? Okay. Is it my turn or is it your turn, Kristin?
I was going to say, so Roger, I mean, the reason that we have Roger here with us today, he's an expert on McKinney, of course. In the McKinney-Vento Act, he's going to describe to us, although many of you have heard of it, it sounds a lot like fostering connections, yet it's also very different. One's an education law, the McKinney-Vento Act, whereas the Fostering Connections Act is a child welfare law. And I know that you all are experts because you've been going to all these education sessions and practicing in your day-to-day work, but a lot of people don't necessarily understand the differences between the two. So what we're going to try and do, especially as it relates to transportation, is talk about the differences between the two laws, how they overlap, and sort of strategies to make sure that you're getting children transportation regardless sort of whether it's under Fostering Connections or McKinney. We're going to try and give you strategies for both. So Roger, if you want to just do, your summary of McKinney, that would be great.
Okay. The McKinney-Vento Act was reauthorized under No Child Left Behind in Title 10, and it talks about school stability for homeless children and youth. And one of the definitions in it, the definition is very broad. It covers more students than might otherwise be considered homeless for other programs. And the reason for that is to make sure that students aren't missed along the way. That anybody who's in any type of a tough scenario for their living conditions can get to school and stay in school. Another term that is used in the McKinney-Vento Act is students awaiting foster care placement. And the law then does not define that. It does not say what that means. And it was left up to states to determine what that means. There was nothing in there that said the states had to have a definition. And so in Nebraska, we don't have one definition. And the reason for that is because what we talked about earlier, the difference in this state, the difference from Madison to McCook to North Platte to Hershey to Omaha. So to try to make one definition that fit all of those different scenarios would have been virtually impossible. So what we do is we give what we think our determination of awaiting foster care placement is, but then we let each school come up with what they think and work with their own people. That way it's not a barrier to programs or 3 programs or whatever is working together to get schools back to their school. McKinney-Vento is very much about keeping their students in their school that they were in when they became homeless. That is called the school of origin in McKinney-Vento. And the school of origin is defined as the school they were attending when they became homeless or the school they are currently attending, whichever is in the best interest of the student. And that term that is used in the other act is used in McKinney too, the best interest, which is the Foster Extension Act, sorry. The best interest determination is used there too. If it's in the best interest of the student not to be in the school of origin, the school has the right to do that, but they have to work with the parents and get parent consent to move them out of the school of origin. If the parents want the children in the school of origin, they have that right, and the school needs to do it. The law does say to the extent feasible. So in a situation where a student is in Grand Island and staying in North Platte, is it going to be feasible to transport them back and forth every day? I think one could argue that probably not. Okay? There are other avenues for doing the school of origin that we'll touch on a little bit later.
And that resides with the biological parents, or can the rights to make those decisions be assigned to the foster parents, or how does that work?
The law says the parent or guardian.
Okay.
So does that answer your question? Parent or guardian. And in the case of an unaccompanied youth who doesn't have a parent or guardian, which does happen sometimes, then it can be the youth or the liaison of the school district. The McKinney-Vento Act requires that every school district have a person who is designated as a homeless education liaison. And that person has several responsibilities of them. One of them is to make sure that the students are in the school of origin, if that's where they want to be. So if you are working on the foster care side and you need to work with a school, that's the question to ask. Who is the liaison of that district? Now, many of our schools, homelessness doesn't occur frequently, and they don't have a person. There's no funds to provide a person, so many times it's the superintendent. And when you call, they may say, yeah, that's me, but the superintendent may literally say, I don't know anything about this, and that might be true, although they should have heard something about it. When they apply for federal funds, they have to answer a couple of questions about homeless students, so they have an inkling. So the law is applicable to every school in the state. We do allow Title I-A funds to be used for some McKinney-Vento expenses. Title I-A is it's the largest federal formula program in the state. Just about every school district gets some Title I-A funds. I think there are 3 that do not. So there are a couple of handouts that I put in your little flash drive. One of them is a summary of the McKinney-Vento Act. Basically, one of the components of the act is the school of origin. But basically what the law is really about is removing barriers. And if a student has been identified as homeless, the school must, it doesn't say if they want to, it says must remove those barriers and keep that student in school. Whatever the barrier is, it needs to be removed. Okay? That's kind of a summary of the McKinney. Question of the McKinney part for a little bit? Just touch on it. It's complicated. But basically, if you remember one thing, if there's a barrier, it has to be removed. Yes?
Is there any talk at all about maybe formalizing the McKinney-Vento Act and providing parents, guardians, the rights and responsibilities in McKinney-Vento, much like we do for special education.
The liaison is supposed to inform parents of their rights whenever a student is identified as homeless. They're supposed to. So, yes, that's something that should be done. How it is done isn't as clear-cut as special education, an IEP plan or that sort of thing. But the parents are supposed to be informed of their rights. And among those rights are to go to school, the school of origin, and the transportation issues and so forth. So, good question. Their reauthorization, whenever it happens, if it ever happens, which I'm kind of sure will someday, there's going to be some more talk about it. There's going to be maybe some talk about an actual per pupil amount for homeless students. That's going to be required to set aside a certain amount of Title I funds for coordination and information and so forth. Good question. Yes?
So when a child is taken into state custody but maybe in a shelter, then I assume that they're considered homeless because it's not a foster care placement, and the school would be responsible for the transportation. And if they're actually placed in a foster home, does that responsibility then end with the school and start with the department, or?
That's my determination, and that's what I tell students. Awaiting foster care placement to me means if they're taking and placed in a shelter or some other temporary situation until they're placed in that home where it's intended that they're going to be until they can get back to their parents, then that's the homeless part. Now, the thing to know about the McKinney Act, once they're identified as homeless, they're entitled to the rights of the law for the duration of that school year.
Does that include transportation?
Not necessarily, unless transportation is a barrier. And anytime transportation is a barrier, the school has the obligation to remove that barrier. But that's where you get into, okay, whose responsibility is it? If they're placed, then whose responsibility is it? The McKinney Act talks about providing that during the time that they're homeless. Once they're placed, they're now where they should be. It's my determination that that becomes
can you talk a little bit more about what rights they retain during the school year that are covered by McKinney-Vento?
They still have the right to go to the school of origin. They still have the right, like I said, basically remove any barriers that they have to go into school and succeed in school.
Except for transportation.
That's where it gets complicated. If I would say, the law isn't real specific on this, but I would say that every student in foster care should be provided transportation by the school. I'm going to have 249 administrators coming to me and saying that's not possible. Because then this is where
we feel your pain.
So the law doesn't, the law says if it's a barrier, but is it a barrier then once they're placed in their foster care? Is there no money to get them to school? Is there no way to do it? If that does happen, what I'm going to tell a school is yes, get that kid to school. The important thing here is the kid. But then I'm going to have to ask the people on the foster side, I don't know if you use the right terminology, sorry, why can't you provide the transportation? See what I'm saying? Just like if a student becomes permanently housed during the year, if their family wins the lot and they become housed, or gets a new great job or whatever, suddenly has plenty of funds, has a new car, can drive their kids to school, it's not a barrier here. And to take advantage of the law then would be inappropriate. And the school personnel have the responsibility to make sure that people don't take advantage of the law. Does that make sense? It's not clear cut. But if they're in a situation and let's say the fostering, the funds are not there, there's just absolutely no money there. There's no money. We cannot transport this foster kid to school. We cannot. There's no way we can possibly do this. We can't. School people, this child was homeless during this year. You have a responsibility. Yes, they do. But I would think the thing you're going to have to work with the school on is explain how there is absolutely no way, no funds, nothing to get that child to school. I understand it all comes down to money. I know that. And schools are under the same constraints as everybody is. So What we tell people is to talk, work together, and figure out ways. And be creative with how you figure out transportation ways. Transportation doesn't have to be running a bus out every time. That's probably the most expensive way of doing transportation, is running a bus out. And we'll talk more about that as we move along. Kristin, is it the right time to talk about that, or am I jumping ahead?
Yeah, that'd be great. I just was going to say thanks, Roger. That's helpful. And I think, a couple of takeaways from what Roger said. Unfortunately, for everyone in the room and everyone across the country, it's just not clear cut. There's not a black and white answer. I can tell you that some of the places that have been the most successful are the ones that are the least adversarial. I think it's easy to kind of point the finger at the other agency and say, you need to provide transportation, or you need to, because we all sort of know the fiscal constraints that are out there. But the places that have been most successful are the ones that are really truly trying to operate in a collaborative spirit and trying to be creative about cost sharing, trying to be creative about how to best leverage sort of the dollars that are out there for transportation. Some have found that coming up with sort of a specific agreement ahead of time helps. I'll use Philadelphia as one example, where they say if the transportation is within 5 miles of the school district, even if it's outside of the school district, then the school district will figure out a way to make it work. But anything outside of that, the child welfare agency is responsible for paying. In Philadelphia, 5 miles is a big difference. That's just one example of trying to agree ahead of time. There's been other places that have sort of come up with maps. One example is Fort Lauderdale, Florida, which, although it is a big urban district, it also is very expansive. To drive from one end of the district to the other end takes about an hour and a half. And so what the school basically has done has come up with a map outlining sort of what their transportation system looks like, that they give to caseworkers to say, if you can place in X, Y, or Z area of this map, there's a much better chance that we can coordinate transportation than if you do it in one of the other districts. And it's not just actually based on distance, it's also sort of based on where they have pre-existing bus routes and things like that. So those are just sort of two examples of trying to really sit down at the table ahead of time and collaborate to come up with a little bit of a plan or an agreement about what works best. Because as Roger said perfectly, it's really a very gray area, and it's tough because there's not always black and white ideas of how to provide transportation or who's actually responsible.
Right.
So in terms of the actual laws, McKinney-Vento and fostering connections, everyone's always looking for a bright line rule, and there isn't one. I can tell you in terms of the differences between the laws, the McKinney-Vento Act is an education law. It's been around for much longer, so they have a lot more experience within the education system. And frankly, the McKinney-Vento Act is everything Fostering Connections wishes it could be. It has, a clear liaison in the schools. As Roger said, schools oftentimes don't necessarily have these liaisons because of funding constraints, but it's at least clear that there should be a point of contact there. There's a state coordinator in every state, like Roger, who is sort of supposed to be responsible for making sure the program's running effectively, answering the types of tricky questions that come up. But most importantly, I think about McKinney-Vento is that it's very clear that for children who are eligible for the law, transportation must be provided by the school. And so it's, for purposes of McKinney-Vento, if you're eligible, well, eligibility is a little bit of a gray area. Once you're eligible, it's clear transportation needs to be provided. Fostering Connections, on the other hand, is a little bit more gray. It's a child welfare law, as we talked about. It's a very big deal because child welfare agencies really are trying now to ensure school stability. But while it says that the child needs to remain in their same school, that the child welfare agency needs to ensure that they remain, that's the word used, unless it's not in their best interest, there isn't a clear entitlement to transportation. And not only is it not clear as to whether or not they're entitled to transportation, it's also not entirely clear who should be providing that transportation. I think that many people, many advocates especially, make the argument that if the requirement is for child welfare to ensure that ultimately a responsibility to provide transportation when it's necessary also flows from that responsibility. But again, it's very far from black and white, and there's a lot of discretion there as to how to actually provide that, or who needs to provide it. Also about fostering connections is that while it does say that the agency needs to ensure transportation, and this is for all children that are in foster care, the federal funding that is allowed for reimbursement to support child welfare agencies in providing that reimbursement doesn't apply to all children that are in care. So without getting into all the specifics, it's approximately 50% of the children that are in foster care are eligible for this reimbursement, and even the reimbursement is not a full reimbursement, it's only partial. So it further sort of muddies the already muddy waters in terms of how do you adequately provide transportation, and what should child welfare agencies do. All that being said, we're going to talk through a couple of strategies that have worked in places to try and provide transportation creatively. But before we get into some of those specific examples, I want to highlight how important it is to before you even worry about trying to move children into different school districts and then transport them back to the same district. Obviously, the best practice would be to figure out a way to keep children living in their same school communities. And I know, the challenges that you face in Nebraska are no different than the challenges that are faced in every other state. There's a lack of placements, a lack of foster homes, a lack of places for children to be able to remain in their home community, and oftentimes they're placed at far distances. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways to try and improve the number of living placements that are out there. The first is school-based recruitment. It's a simple idea, and one that agencies have been finding growing. They've basically been finding that it's been very successful, and that's that it's difficult to recruit foster placements when you're just sort of advertising on the TV or sending out flyers. But if you're doing it when you realize that there are specific school communities that you really do need increased numbers of foster placements, it's easier to recruit foster parents when the parents know that it's friends of their own children. It's children at their own school and in their own community who are needing support. So just simple things like sending home a letter through the school PTA or through the school folder that goes home, just saying that they're desperately seeking foster placements and to please contact the child welfare agency if you're interested. It's an easy thing to do, and one that agencies who have moved forward with doing that have really found a lot of support. So again, trying to make sure that you're working together with the schools, using schools as a resource to try and identify potential living placements. Beyond that, working together with students and their families at removal or when placement changes are happening to identify whether there might be potential living placements, whether, as part of their family or their relatives, or whether it's friends or teachers or people that might be potential living placements also. So again, it takes planning and it takes advanced planning, which, as we all know in the child welfare system, doesn't always happen. But when it does, it can really increase the number of children who are able to live near their home school. Another example of sort of trying to keep children living in their same communities is making sure that school placements and distance to school is even being considered when you are making living placements. I don't know, I'm sure that it works in many different places depending on the regions in Nebraska, but in a lot of places, the place where the child is living and where they go to school is not necessarily a factor in making the determination about where they're placed. It's more about where there's an available bed or a place that has enough beds for all the siblings. So one example, Illinois has moved towards moving almost like a Google Maps type geomap program. And basically, when a child is going to be moved, they type in the address of the school and it runs a search of homes based on proximity to the school. So, it runs a number of other factors also, but it's at least considering the child's school placement and making those initial living placement decisions. And as you all know, if you can sort of put a little bit of planning in ahead of time, sometimes some of those far distance moves can actually be eliminated or alleviated. Does anyone have any examples of, whether that's happening in your community, whether you have been able to increase the number of living placements that are near a child's school?
That's happening in Omaha. When we look for foster placements, that's on the referral. That's one of the very first questions all the agencies that we work with ask is what school district. And then they search their homes based on what school they live in. So that part is happening.
Kristin, did you hear that okay?
I heard in Omaha it's happening, and then what else was?
That was basically she just said how. And I need to tell you, we lost your video. We can hear you just fine right now, just so you know. People can't see you anymore.
Okay, great.
So.
That's good news for me.
We had a question in the back. Did you still have that question, or? Okay, we're good right now? Okay. Go ahead, Kristin. Did I interrupt you?
So again, I know you're all here because you all know the fiscal challenges that are out there, and you know how difficult it is when the school's saying we can't provide transportation and the child welfare agency is saying we can't provide transportation, but you all know that it needs to happen. I included this slide about how many children need transportation arranged by child welfare because I think child welfare agencies, they're not in the habit of providing school transportation, and so then it flashes up as just pure dollar signs. And so this is really a reminder that not every single child is going to require transportation under fostering connections. First of all, not every child in foster care is even of school age. So if you start eliminating the number of children who aren't even in school age or may not be in high school or have graduated, not all children, as we talked about, are going to be placed out of school boundaries. Oftentimes you're able to find placements that are near the child's school, or at least with minimum hassle to be able to keep them in the same school. There's going to be a large number of children who, for whatever reason, it's not in their best interest to remain in the same school. I mean, it might be that they're in some type of a relative placement that's far away, but that has more of a long-term permanency option than some other placement. And it might be too far of a distance for a child to travel, so it might not be in their best interest. There will be a number of children who it really does make sense to move into a new school district and get acclimated there. There's some children, as Roger was saying, that are in the child welfare system that will be covered under the McKinney-Vento Act, whether they're placed in a shelter or an emergency placement. For those children, the McKinney-Vento program, the school will provide transportation. And finally, there will be some children who, because of their special education needs, might have transportation written into their special education plan. And in those cases, again, the transportation would be provided by the school, not by the child welfare agency. So again, this is just sort of for those at room to understand as you're trying to work with child welfare agencies to be able to provide transportation on some type of a systematic basis. This is a reminder that not every child in foster care will require transportation under fostering connections.
And let me chime in there real quick, Kristin. I think this is a good spot to say it. McKinney talks about transportation. There's no doubt about it. But it gives three scenarios when you need to provide transportation. The school of origin while the student is homeless. That's clear cut. The district must provide it at the parent request. And the school district must inform the parents that they have that right. So as long as it's feasible to do so, that must be done. Otherwise, if the school of origin is no longer an issue, then the school district is required to transport homeless students just like they would any other student. If the school district doesn't provide transportation inside of a half-a-mile radius, just for an example, then that homeless student can be expected to walk just like non-homeless students. Okay? Unless the third scenario is if lack of transportation is a barrier. The example the law gives in law guidance is if a student had to cross a very busy intersection and the student was a kindergartner. Okay? That might be a situation where transportation is a barrier. Okay? And that's kind of personal to me. Just a little side note. He's fine now. My son was crossing a very busy street in Lincoln this summer on his bike and got hit by a car. He's fine now, but he's in fifth grade. And he was doing everything right except the fact that in Lincoln, you're not supposed to ride your bike in crosswalks. I didn't know that. You're supposed to get off and walk your bike in crosswalks. So he was there, he technically was riding his bike. Anyway, that's a side note, but it's a relevant example because it is that situation. Another example we talked about is if a student would break a leg and can't walk to school, and the parents don't have a car because they're in a homeless situation, then the school district needs to work on providing transportation. So those are the three scenarios where transportation is absolutely talked about in the McKinney. Okay? And a couple of creative examples we've had in this state. I know you always have liability issues. I understand that. So I'm not saying these all will work with everybody, but one scenario we had in a town, I'll just tell you, it's in Fremont. They had some students in a shelter, and to run a bus out every day was going to cost $150 a day, they estimated. And this was like in February, and the students were going to be, knew they were going to be there for a while. So they called me up and said they talked to the parents. Their kids want to ride bikes to school, but they don't have bikes. Can we buy them some bikes so that the kids can ride their bikes to school just like everybody else? And what a creative way. 2 bikes cost $150. They rode their bikes every day except for horrible weather condition days, which we know happens in Nebraska, just like Milwaukee. But most days, that worked out fine. They made arrangements on the other days. I told them, make sure that the parents go along with this and get something in writing from the parents so the parents know you're doing this. That helps in a liability case. But you're going to have liability no matter what way you do it. I mean, a bus can get in an accident just like the kid you can get on his bike crossing the street. So, other examples we talked about, and they're showing me 10 minutes, Kristin, so I'll wrap up my comments real quick and back to you.
No hurry. This is the heart of it.
Other ways, cross communities, a school found that they had a homeless kid in this town. They had a teacher coming from that town to this town. Parents had no problem with it. Pay the teacher a little extra mileage so the teacher gets a win. The student gets to school, and it doesn't cost the district nearly as much to transport the kid. It's a win for everybody. Again, I understand liability issues. Make sure the parents are in agreement with what you're doing. That's the number one key. That's one of the things the McKinney-Vento Act did when it was reauthorized under No Child Left Behind. The parents absolutely need to be informed in all aspects of decision making, parent or guardian, whoever that may be. Okay? All right, Kristin. Throw it back to you.
Yeah, so I mean, those are just 2 examples from Roger about creative solutions. I think the key is that people, when they're talking about school transportation, automatically assume that it needs to be a bus route from point A to point B. And what we've learned, not only from the experience of McKinney-Vento, but also from child welfare agencies across the country, is that creative solutions are the key. So coming up with, talking to the students that are, or talking to the other individuals and adults in the child's life to see whether there might be some relative or someone involved who isn't a placement resource. It's not, appropriate for whatever reason for the child to live there, but they might be a transportation resource. And so it doesn't always have to be that the foster parent is required to be providing transportation, because we all know that for foster parents this oftentimes isn't possible. It might be, though, that providing some type of a mileage reimbursement will make a big difference. Whether it's a teacher or some other adult in the child's case, seeing whether, that they can have a small mileage reimbursement would make a big difference and would certainly cost a lot less than what's used in some places, which is getting a taxi or a contract transportation provider or a bus to go from point A to point B. It might be the kind of thing where, because of whatever the school bus routes are, having the child dropped off somewhere on the school bus route makes a lot shorter of a distance to school than it would be trying to figure out the way to get the bus to be routed out. And again, these seem like simple answers or simple solutions, but oftentimes people aren't asking those questions. People aren't asking, is there some way? They're not calling the school to say, would there be some way that, we could reimburse you if you could, add an additional stop for the child? Or is there something that we could do to try and collaborate on this? Again, people aren't always asking the questions, and most of all, child welfare agencies might not be asking the questions, but attorneys and judges also aren't asking the questions. So in the courtroom, when school moves are happening, You know, don't just assume that it has to happen and that there's no other placement. Make sure to ask the agency, did you consider other placements? Were there any placements available near the child's school? You know, are there any other transportation options? Just to sort of get the agencies in the practice of asking these questions. Again, you know, this is a new law. It's being implemented sort of slowly, and child welfare agencies, especially now, are just really struggling with all the fiscal constraints. But at least trying to ask the questions will sort of start to trickle down and change practice a little bit in terms of trying to be creative and trying to work together with the school and, frankly, the child and the child's family to identify whether there's any creative solutions that are out there. Does anyone have any examples of, you know, what has worked in your area in terms of providing transportation? Any solutions that are out there or tips?
Not seeing any hands right
No
now.
solutions.
You
I
know,
guess that's why you're all at this session.
and it's hard. Nebraska, just like every state, presents unique difficulties with transportation. We go from having very urban areas like Omaha that have the large city problems to very rural areas that have distance problems. So it is difficult. We understand that. And so what I try to work with when I talk to superintendents or liaisons is how do we find that way? And usually something can happen. I spoke with a couple school districts where, yeah, they worked out something where the student came over one way with one student with one school and the other way with the other school. Work it out. You know, it's a case-by-case basis, just like identification is for homeless students. It's on a case-by-case basis. I know it's a lot of work. It is. I talk to transportation directors and I tell them, you know what you need to do for every one of these headaches you have, keep a file. Watch that kid get through school and graduate. And then you say, you know what, if I had not stuck with it, if I hadn't done this communication, that student might not be getting that diploma right now. And that, by the way, that transportation director did that, and he told me that really helped. It just, something motivated. Yes, go ahead.
Do we have a list of the liaisons in the different school districts? Because I feel like in Omaha, we're so structured, and there's a set of rules, and not everybody knows, and I think maybe West.
John Bright. John Bright is the liaison for the Omaha Public Schools.
Is there a list of all?
There is on our website. The problem is it's usually about a year retroactive because we can't pull the data from this year's applications until the school districts have all applied. So your best bet, if you need to know a liaison, my contact information is on that PowerPoint. Sorry, I don't have any cards with me. You can certainly call me and I will tell you who's listed as the most recent liaison. I can give you a phone number to call and you can at least ask for somebody. And that's a good way to touch base with me anyway, because once you do that, then I'll kind of know there might be a situation. Because usually what happens after you call a superintendent that's a liaison who doesn't know much about this, guess who they then call? Me. And then I can inform them and we can all be on the same page. And that's how a lot of times works. So.
Because I think, I could be wrong, but I think Omaha has a 3-mile rule, and I don't know if that's related to the Vinton or if it's something separate. But we tried to do the creative things where, you know, a kid lives 3 blocks away, and he just walk to that bus pickup and still stay in school, and we then told no. But I don't know if we're going to the right people or asking the right questions. To me, the OPS system is very confusing. I don't know who I should be going to ask what questions.
Let's get together afterwards and we'll talk
Please.
about it. Okay.
And John Wright is a liaison for Omaha, and he works hard at it. He really does. He tries hard. It's just a big, tough job.
Yeah, I would not want his job.
And a shameless plug here, there's a homeless conference coming up at UNO on September 10th and 11th, and John and I and Chris Webster from Lincoln are going to be talking more about the McKinney-Vento Act and 10th and 11th. If you email me at the end, I'll send you a link to how to register for that conference. It's kind of a little bit flying by the seat of our pants on the conference, getting it ready, getting something done for this year. So sorry about that shameless plug.
What's your email? What's your email?
It'll be at the contact information at the end.
Oh, okay.
Do you have a little flash drive with the PowerPoint on it? See me afterwards. Okay. If you need any information, I'm going to be around in the morning. Talk to me afterwards. Okay? Kristin, I just got the 5-minute card a few minutes ago. So.
Okay, great. You know, we can just wrap up. I mean, in terms of solutions, again, this is an hour session. We don't have all the answers. All that I can tell you is that from my perspective, from traveling around to different states, Nebraska has very similar challenges to what are happening in other places. You know, other places also have both rural and urban districts. They have long distances to be worrying about. They have fiscal constraints. You have different child welfare agencies that act differently in different regions. And schools, you know, some schools are more supportive than others. A lot of schools are very sort of local control and aren't necessarily as interested in collaborating. These are problems and challenges everywhere, but I can tell you that transportation is happening, that simple solutions make a big difference, and that, you know, sitting down at the same table ahead of time to try and come up with some type of an agreement so that then you kind of know what the black and white is, oftentimes works. But if you don't have sort of the leaders in the administration within child welfare and the school at the table, then at least on a case-by-case basis, you know, working together with the homeless liaison, calling the school to see whether there's some type of coordinating that can happen, you know, the child's caseworker working together with the child's attorney and the CASA to try and really think creatively and think outside the box makes a big difference. You know, in terms of fostering connections, agencies still have a lot of room to go in terms of implementing. But the important thing is that written into that law for the very first time is a true responsibility on the child welfare agency to ensure school stability. So if they're not already starting a process for making a best interest decision and trying to ensure that children are placed closer to school, trying to ensure that they're able to remain in their same school, they should be. And it's really, I think, the role of judges and attorneys to make sure that child welfare agencies are starting that process and really beginning to kind of take these questions into consideration. A few resources that are available for you, all available on our website. We have an entire, you know, this session was really just on transportation, but I think it really raises broader questions of how do you support keeping kids in their same communities? How do you make best interest decisions for kids and who should be involved? What should you do when disputes arise? You know, we have a checklist for judges, we have a checklist for states on implementing fostering connections, and these are all available as part of our Fostering Connections Toolkit that's available on our website. You know, as we got into, as Roger and I talked about, there's a lot of overlap between the McKinney-Vento Act and the Fostering Connections Act, and there's a lot of confusion that's out there. And so we have a whole series about the overlap between these two laws, but one that I'll highlight for you in particular is a quick Q&A. It's just a 2-pager that kind of outlines the different rights and responsibilities under each. And I think this really helps to kind of clarify, you know, who should be providing transportation and in what cases, should Fostering Connections be providing transportation. That's also available on our website. One thing we didn't talk at all about today is information sharing and data collection around foster care and education. There's oftentimes a lack of information between these two agencies. Child welfare agencies oftentimes don't even have the child's student records or know a lot about where a child is even placed or where they should be placed. And so we have a number of tools that are available on fact sheets and Q&As around that to kind of talk about where the confidentiality barriers are and how to sort of overcome some of those barriers. And then the final thing I'll highlight that we have on our project is a searchable database. We're actually about to launch both a new website and a new searchable database within the next 3 weeks. If you join our listserv, which you all should, then you'll stay up to date with exactly when it's launched. But the searchable database is really a great tool to stay up to date with everything that's out there. So if you're interested in a particular topic, or if you want to see everything that applies to your specific state, or whatever it might be, the database is sort of the one-stop shop to find what's out there. I think the most important lesson to take away is that when it comes to issues of foster care and education, no system has time to do it on their own. Every system is sort of overburdened. And so before thinking about creating some type of new tool or some type of new protocol, you can be pretty sure that some other jurisdiction has dealt with a similar issue and that they're having a similar problem. And so I really encourage you to stay in touch with me. Let me know what your challenges are, because if you're facing an issue, there's a good chance that someone else has too. and that hopefully we can work together to come up with a good solution. Our contact information is at the end. I just really encourage you to stay in touch, and Roger, thanks especially for coming. Your experience with McKinney, I think, is going to be the most helpful in trying to help us figure out how to implement fostering connections.
Right, and I think you hit it right on the head a little while ago. McKinney is intentionally written broad, fill in the gaps where there may be gaps. And that's a good way of looking at it. So, right on.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.